A polite request, a simple human need. That's all it was. But on Ascend Air Flight 815, suspended 37,000 feet above the Earth, that request was met with a cold, unyielding wall of prejudice. For Dr. Annalise Dubois, a woman of immense accomplishment and quiet dignity, the next 10 minutes would become a crucible, testing her patience and resolve. For the flight attendant who denied her those same 10 minutes would be the start of a catastrophic, life-altering countdown. What you're about to hear isn't just a story of a woman denied a bathroom. It's a story of hidden power, gross miscalculation, and the swift, devastating karma that follows when you underestimate the person standing right in front of you. The recycled air of Ascend Air Flight 815 from Los Angeles to New York was a familiar, sterile hum. For Dr. Annalise Dubois, it was the monotonous soundtrack to a life lived between two coasts, a life of research lectures and high-stakes consulting. At 42, she had cultivated an aura of serene authority. Her bespoke blazer sharp but comfortable, and the weight of the medical journals in her carry-on were testaments to a career built on precision and intellect. She was a leading immunologist, but her niche specialty was far more specific aerospace medicine. She studied the physiological effects of high-altitude environments on the human body, a field that made her a highly sought-after consultant for both the National Transportation Safety Board NTSB and, more frequently, the Federal Aviation Administration FAA. The flight had been smooth, a rare gift on a cross-country haul. Annalise had spent the first 3 hours reviewing data for an upcoming NTSB panel review on pilot fatigue. Beside her, her husband David, a corporate litigator with a mind as sharp as the crease in his trousers, was engrossed in a novel. They were a quiet, formidable pair, exuding a confidence that was earned, not inherited. About 4 hours into the flight, somewhere over Nebraska, Annalise felt a familiar, unwelcome pressure in her lower abdomen. It was a known side effect of a new medication she was taking for a minor but persistent autoimmune condition, sudden, intense discomfort that only relieving her bladder could alleviate. It wasn't a casual urge. It was a medical necessity. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The sign was off. She gave David's shoulder a light squeeze and made her way down the aisle toward the lavatory at the rear of the economy cabin. The first-class bathroom was closer, but she was a stickler for rules and preferred not to impose. Standing guard by the galley clipboard in hand was a flight attendant. Her name tag read Heather. Heather Thompson was in her late 20s with blonde hair pulled back into a severe ponytail and a thin-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She carried herself with an air of self-importance that seemed disproportionate to her role, a low-level manager drunk on the smallest sip of power. As Annalise approached, Heather held up a flat palm, a gesture one might use to stop traffic. "The lavatory is closed right now, ma'am." Annalise paused, glancing at the vacant sign on the bathroom door. "Oh, is there a maintenance issue?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "We're beginning our initial preparations for descent," Heather stated, her tone clipped. "The captain wants the cabin secured." Annalise frowned. She glanced at the flight map on the screen in front of a vacant seat. They were still over an hour and a half away from JFK. Initial preparations for descent wouldn't begin for at least another 45 minutes. She knew the protocols intimately. "With all due respect," Annalise said, keeping her voice low and polite, "we're still a considerable distance from our destination. I have a medical need to use the restroom. It will only take a moment." Heather's eyes flickered over Annalise, a micro-assessment that took in her dark skin, her braided hair, and her calm but firm posture. It was a look Annalise had seen 1,000 times before, the look of someone making a snap judgment based on prejudice, cloaking it in the flimsy armor of procedure. As I said, Heather repeated, her voice becoming patronizing, we are preparing for descent. You'll have to return to your seat. She gestured down the aisle with her pen. The injustice of it was a small, hot spark in Annalise's chest. She was a doctor. She was a federal consultant on this very industry. She knew for a fact that what the flight attendant was saying was at best a misrepresentation of the rules, and at worst an outright lie. The physical discomfort was now sharpening into a painful urgency. Perhaps you could check with the captain, Annalise suggested, still maintaining a professional tone. I'm sure he would understand that a passenger with a medical— I don't need to check with the captain. Heather snapped, her customer service veneer cracking. I know the regulations. Now please return to your seat, or I'll have to report you as a non-compliant passenger. The threat was absurd. Non-compliant. For needing to use a bathroom when the seatbelt sign was off, other passengers were starting to notice the quiet confrontation. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A young couple looked up from their movie. Annalise felt a flush of anger, but she suppressed it. Escalating this with a belligerent crew member at 37,000 feet was not the answer. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Very well, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more chilling than a shout. I will return to my seat. She turned and walked back up the aisle, her movements graceful despite the growing pain. David looked up, his brow furrowed in concern. Everything all right, Annie? She sat down, her face a mask of composure. The flight attendant has refused to let me use the lavatory. David's eyes hardened. On what grounds? She claims they are preparing for descent. He glanced at his watch, then at the flight map. That's ridiculous. We're not even over Pennsylvania yet. Did you tell her it was medical? She wasn't interested, Annalise said, breathing slowly to manage the pain. She threatened to report me. David's jaw clenched. As a litigator, he recognized the dangerous mix of ignorance and authority. This was no longer about a simple rule. It was about an abuse of power. Okay, he said softly, his legal mind already cataloguing the violations. Don't worry. We're not done with this. Annalise leaned her head back, closing her eyes. The physical pain was intense, but it was the humiliation, the sheer audacity of the discrimination that burned brighter. Heather Thompson had made a critical mistake. She thought she was dealing with just another passenger she could bully into submission. She had no idea who Dr. Annalise Dubois really was, and she had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. The pain was becoming a central throbbing point in Annalise's consciousness. It radiated from her abdomen, a relentless pressure that made it difficult to think. Each breath was a carefully controlled effort to keep from doubling over. She knew the pharmacology of her medication intimately. The diuretic side effect was potent and unforgiving. This wasn't a matter of comfort anymore. It was rapidly approaching a medical emergency. Dehydration was a risk, but so was the severe strain on her bladder and kidneys. David watched her, his face a storm of controlled fury. He unbuckled his own seatbelt. I'll go talk to her, he said, his voice low. I'll be polite, but I'll be firm. David, don't— Annalise managed to say, her voice strained. She's already escalated this. You'll just give her an excuse to involve the captain and frame us as disruptive. Then what are we supposed to do? Let you sit here in agony? He shot back, his protective instincts overriding his usual courtroom calm. This is unacceptable. It's a violation of the airline passenger's Bill of Rights, not to mention basic human decency. Annalise knew he was right, but a direct confrontation was a losing game. It would become their word against her crew members, and the crew always held the initial advantage. They needed a different kind of leverage. Just then, another flight attendant, older, and with a name tag that read Brenda, approached their row. She was the purser, the lead flight attendant for the cabin, and she moved with the weary authority of a long-serving veteran. Brenda had likely been summoned by Heather. "Is there a problem here?" Brenda asked, her tone suggesting they were the source of the problem, not the victims of it. David turned to her, his voice the epitome of reasonableness. "Yes, there is. My wife has a medical condition that requires her to use the lavatory urgently. Your colleague," he gestured vaguely toward the back, "has refused her access, claiming you're preparing for descent, which is clearly not the case." Brenda glanced from David to Annalise, her expression impassive. Annalise could see Heather hovering in the background, watching the exchange with a vindicated smirk. It was clear this wasn't a search for a solution. It was a show of force. "Heather was following procedure," Brenda said flatly. "The forward lavatory is for first-class passengers only, and the rear lavatories are being prepared for landing. There's nothing I can do." The lie was now twofold, and even more blatant. The cabin was still in mid-flight service. A cart was slowly making its way down the opposite aisle. Nothing was being prepared for landing. And while the forward lavatory was designated for first class, it was standard, often mandated by policy, to allow an economy passenger with a medical need to use it. "That is categorically false," Annalise said, her voice now tight with pain and frustration. She opened her eyes and met Brenda's gaze directly. "I am a medical doctor. My specialty is aerospace medicine. I consult for the FAA. I know the regulations, and you are not following them. You are in fact creating a potential medical incident and a serious safety issue." For a moment, Brenda's composure flickered. The mention of the FAA was a direct hit, but she quickly recovered, her face hardening. She likely assumed it was a bluff, an empty threat from an angry passenger. "Claiming to be an FAA consultant is a serious matter, ma'am," Brenda said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'd be careful who you say that to." She then leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, threatening whisper. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but we've had a long flight. Just sit back, be quiet, and we'll be on the ground in a little while. Don't make this a bigger issue than it needs to be." It was the final straw. The dismissal, the condescension, the transparently racist assumption that she, a black woman, was just a problem to be managed. The physical pain was now a white-hot nova, but a cold, clear resolve cut through it. She looked past Brenda to Heather, who was now standing with her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. They were a team. This was a pattern. This was not about regulations. This was about power and prejudice. Annalise turned to David and said something quietly, inaudibly to the two flight attendants. David's eyes widened slightly. Then he nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He sat back in his seat, the picture of compliance. Annalise reached into her bag, her movement slow and deliberate. She pulled out her work phone, a separate encrypted device. Brenda and Heather watched her, assuming she was perhaps recording them, a common, but ultimately toothless gesture. "Ma'am, recording crew members is against airline policy," Brenda said, her voice laced with manufactured authority. Annalise didn't even look up. She ignored them completely. Her fingers flew across the screen, her thumbs tapping out a message with practiced speed. It wasn't a social media post. It wasn't a complaint to the airline's customer service bot. It was a direct, secure text message. She knew the flight had gate-to-gate Wi-Fi, a service Ascend Air advertised heavily. She also knew that a secure text protocol could punch through the limited bandwidth. The message was short, clinical, and packed with regulatory terminology. To Miles Peterson, FAA Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety, from Dr. A. Dubois. Subject: urgent, in-flight safety and medical incident, ACA 815, Miles on Ascend Air, 8:15, LAX JFK. Experiencing a Level 2 medical necessity. Medication-induced. Crew led by Purser Brenda Miller and FA Heather Thompson are denying lavatory access, citing false landing preparations approx. 90 mins to destination. This constitutes a regulatory violation under 14 CFR Part 121 and a potential in-flight medical emergency. They are non-responsive to medical disclosure, requesting immediate intervention. Passenger safety compromised. She hit send. The timestamp on the message was 1:23 p.m. Central Time. Brenda scoffed. "Go ahead, send your little email. It won't be read for days." She turned to Heather. "Let's get back to it. Looks like our passenger has decided to cooperate." They walked away, chuckling quietly to each other, confident in their victory. They had put the uppity woman in her place. Annalise leaned her head back again, her eyes closed. The pain was still there, a roaring fire. But now it was accompanied by something else, the cold, certain knowledge of what was about to happen. She glanced at her phone. A single check mark appeared next to her message. Delivered. David took her hand. "How long?" he whispered. "Not long," Annalise breathed. "The Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety doesn't like to be kept waiting." 10 minutes. That's all the time Heather Thompson and Brenda Miller had left in their world of blissful ignorance. The clock had started ticking. Miles Peterson was not a man who enjoyed interruptions. His office on the 10th floor of the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. was a fortress of bureaucratic calm, a place where national aviation policy was forged in the fires of endless meetings and stacks of reports. He was a career man, a former air traffic controller, who had worked his way up the ladder through sheer competence and an encyclopedic knowledge of federal aviation regulations. His desk was neat, his suit was immaculate, and his patience was thin. When his encrypted work phone buzzed with a high-priority notification, he almost ignored it. It was 2:24 p.m. Eastern Time. He was in the middle of a briefing on new runway safety protocols. But the notification protocol was specific. It bypassed the usual gatekeepers and signaled a direct message from a top-tier consultant on an active channel. He excused himself from the meeting, his brow furrowed. He opened the message from Dr. Annalise Dubois. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, and then to a cold, focused anger. He knew Dr. Dubois well. She wasn't just a consultant. She was one of the sharpest minds he'd ever worked with. Her reports were models of clarity and precision. She was unflappable professional and utterly devoid of hyperbole. If she sent a message like this, it was not an exaggeration. It was a fact. He read the message again, the key phrases leaping out at him. Level 2 medical necessity. Denying lavatory access. False landing preparations. 14 CFR Part 121. Passenger safety compromised. This wasn't a customer service complaint. This was a safety report from a trusted expert in real time from 37,000 feet in the air. A crew was actively obstructing a passenger with a stated medical need, and in doing so, creating a situation that could easily escalate. Worse, they were doing it to one of the very people who helped write the rules they were supposed to be following. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it made his blood run cold. He didn't hesitate. He didn't delegate. He stood up, walked briskly out of his office, and went straight to the FAA's National Operations Control Center, down the hall the nerve center that monitors all air traffic over the United States. "Get me the command center supervisor for the ZAU sector," he commanded, referring to the Chicago Air Route Traffic Control Center that managed the airspace the flight was currently in. "And get me the head of operations for Ascend Air on the line. Now." The control center, usually a hive of calm professional activity, buzzed with a new urgency. Miles Peterson's presence and the steel in his voice were enough to signal a major issue. Within 90 seconds, he was on a multi-line call. "This is Deputy Administrator Peterson. I have an active in-flight incident on Ascend Air 815 call sign ACA 8.5. It is now being classified as a potential safety and security event." On the other end of the line, the Ascend Air executive, a vice president named Frank O'Connell, stammered, "A security event, Mr. Peterson. We've had no reports from the flight crew." "That's because the flight crew is the problem," Miles retorted, his voice like ice. "Your crew is violating federal regulations and creating a medical emergency. I have a credible first-hand report from inside the aircraft. Your purser and another flight attendant have repeatedly denied a passenger with a medical need access to a lavatory, and have done so under false pretenses." There was a stunned silence from Frank O'Connell's end. This was a corporate nightmare unfolding in real time. "Now here's what's going to happen," Miles continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Zayu is going to contact ACA 815 immediately. They will inform the captain that they are to divert to the nearest suitable airport, which looks like Chicago O'Hare. The reason given will be to address a passenger medical issue that the crew is unable to resolve. They will be assigned a priority landing vector. When they touch down, they will not proceed to a gate. They will be met on a hard stand by FAA officials and your corporate security. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," O'Connell squeaked already, imagining the headlines. "And Frank," Miles added, his tone venomous, "I want the names of the entire cabin crew on my desk before that plane touches the ground, specifically Purser Brenda Miller and Flight Attendant Heather Thompson. This is a zero-fail mission. Make it happen." He hung up. The entire exchange, from reading the text to issuing the divert order, had taken less than 8 minutes. Back on Flight 815, Captain Eva Rostova was a woman at ease. She was a 25-year veteran pilot, a consummate professional who had seen everything. The flight was routine, the weather was clear, and she was looking forward to a quiet dinner in New York. Her first officer, a young man named Ben, was handling the comms. Suddenly a call came through from Chicago Center, the voice more clipped and formal than usual. "ACA 815, Chicago Center. How do you copy, Chicago Center? ACA 815 copies. Loud and clear," Ben replied. "ACA 815. Be advised you are to change your destination. You will divert immediately to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. CORD. Acknowledge." Captain Rostova sat bolt upright. A non-requested diversion that meant something was terribly wrong. A bomb threat, a major mechanical failure she didn't know about. "Chicago Center. ACA 815. Confirm diversion to CORD. Can you advise nature of the issue?" Rostova took over the radio. "ACA 815. I confirm divert to CORD. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Turn right, heading 090. Vector for the O'Hare arrival. The nature is a passenger medical situation that requires immediate attention on the ground." Rostova was confused. A medical situation. Her purser hadn't reported anything. Standard procedure was for the crew to inform the cockpit, who would then consult with physicians on the ground to determine if a diversion was necessary. For ATC to order them to divert meant the call had come from somewhere else. Somewhere much, much higher up the chain. "Roger, Chicago. Descending to flight level 240. Heading 090 ACA. She confirmed, her mind racing, as she banked the massive aircraft into its new course. She clicked the intercom to the cabin. "Brenda, get up here, now." In the cabin, the gentle turn and the change in the engine's pitch were subtle, but noticeable. Annalise opened her eyes. She felt the change in direction. She glanced at the flight map. Their icon was no longer heading for New York. It was making a sharp right turn toward Chicago. The timestamp on her phone now read 33 p.m. Central Time. Exactly 10 minutes after she had hit send, David looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "They're diverting the plane," he whispered. Annalise simply nodded, the cool certainty of her actions settling over her. The cavalry hadn't just been called. They had rerouted the entire battlefield, and for Heather Thompson and Brenda Miller, the war was already lost. They just didn't know it yet. The chime for the flight deck was sharp and insistent. Brenda Miller, still feeling smug from her de-escalation of the situation with Annalise, straightened her uniform and walked toward the cockpit. She assumed the captain wanted a routine pre-descent briefing, even if it was a bit early. Heather gave her a knowing nod as she passed a small sign of their shared victory. Brenda entered the cockpit, and the door clicked shut behind her. The atmosphere was tense. Captain Rostova was focused on her instruments, her face grim. First Officer Ben looked pale. "Brenda, what the hell is going on in your cabin?" Captain Rostova demanded, without looking up from her controls. Brenda was taken aback. "What do you mean, Captain? Everything is fine. A passenger was being a bit difficult earlier, but I handled it." "Handled it?" Rostova's head snapped around, her eyes blazing. "We've just been ordered by the FAA via air traffic control to divert to Chicago. They told us it was for a passenger medical issue. You haven't reported a single thing to me. So I'll ask you again. What is going on?" The blood drained from Brenda's face. Diverted ordered by the FAA that was unheard of unless it was a hijacking or a bomb. I don't understand. There's no medical issue. The woman in 22B was just making a fuss about the lavatory." "The lavatory?" Ben, the first officer, chimed in, incredulous. "We're diverting a 200-passenger aircraft to one of the world's busiest airports because of a bathroom dispute." "She claimed it was a medical need," Brenda said defensively, her voice starting to tremble. "But she was just being difficult. She said she was some kind of FAA consultant trying to throw her weight around." Captain Rostova stared at Brenda, a horrified understanding dawning on her face. She had flown with Brenda for years. She knew her. She was a stickler for rules, but she also had a mean streak, a tendency to enjoy the power she had over passengers. "Brenda," Rostova said, her voice dangerously quiet. "What was this passenger's name? I don't know. Dubois, I think. Dr. Dubois. She was in 22B. Rostova's blood ran cold. She didn't know Annalise personally, but she knew the name. Dr. Annalise Dubois was a legend in aviation circles. She'd read her papers on G-force effects and circadian rhythm disruption. She was one of the key figures whose research directly influenced the very regulations Rostova followed every day. The woman Brenda had dismissed as difficult was, in all likelihood, one of the most powerful people in their industry who wasn't an airline CEO or the head of the NTSB. And Brenda had threatened her. "Oh God," Rostova breathed, leaning back in her seat. "Brenda, you have made a catastrophic error in judgment. What, she can't just divert a plane because she's angry?" Brenda protested, her panic rising. "She didn't divert the plane," Rostova snapped back. "She reported a safety violation and a brewing medical incident to her colleagues at the FAA, and they diverted the plane. You didn't just deny a passenger the bathroom, you denied a leading FAA medical consultant the bathroom, and then you lied about it. You've put this entire airline in jeopardy." The full weight of her actions crashed down on Brenda. This wasn't a customer service complaint that would get lost in a corporate inbox. This was a 5-alarm fire at the highest level of federal oversight. Rostova keyed the public address microphone. Her voice, when it came, was calm and professional, betraying none of the turmoil in the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen passenger medical situation that requires immediate attention, We will be diverting our flight to Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 25 minutes. Our cabin crew will be coming through the aisle to prepare for our arrival. We apologize for this change in our itinerary and will provide you with more information once we are on the ground." A murmur of confusion and concern rippled through the cabin. Flights get diverted for heart attacks, for strokes, for unruly passengers who have to be restrained. But the cabin was calm. No one looked particularly ill, except for Annalise. She sat with her eyes closed, still and silent, the picture of a person enduring a medical crisis. David held her hand, his expression a mask of stoic anger. They were playing their parts perfectly, because they weren't parts. Annalise was in real debilitating pain. Heather Thompson heard the captain's announcement, and her stomach twisted into a knot. A medical situation. But Brenda had said. She looked down the aisle and saw Brenda stumbling out of the cockpit, her face ashen, her usual confidence completely shattered. Brenda caught Heather's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head, a clear signal that something had gone horribly, terribly wrong. Passengers began to speculate. "Who's sick?" a woman whispered. "I didn't see anything." The man who had been watching the earlier confrontation from across the aisle leaned over to his wife. "I bet you it's that woman," he said, nodding toward Annalise. The flight attendants wouldn't let her use the bathroom. They were awful to her. His wife gasped. The story began to ripple through the rows. The fragments of the confrontation, the captain's announcement, and Annalise's still pained posture coalesced into a narrative. The crew had caused this. Their cruelty had forced the plane to divert. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from confusion to a quiet, simmering anger directed at the flight attendants. Heather felt the stares. She tried to go about her duties, checking seat belts and tray tables, but her hands shook. Every passenger she passed seemed to look at her with contempt. Her petty power trip had backfired in the most public and spectacular way imaginable. She and Brenda were no longer authority figures. They were villains in a drama of their own, making trapped in a metal tube with their accusers and judges. As the plane descended through the clouds over Lake Michigan, the sprawling grid of Chicago coming into view, Annalise finally allowed herself a small, grim satisfaction. The pain was still there, but it was now overshadowed by the impending vindication. She had followed protocol. She had tried to de-escalate. She had been polite. When that failed, she had used the tools available to her, tools of knowledge, of reputation, of access. Heather Thompson and Brenda Miller had built their careers on the flimsy authority of a uniform and a rule book they barely understood. Annalise Dubois had built hers on science data and the respect of the very institution that governed their world. Today, those two worlds had collided, and the fallout was only just beginning. The landing at O'Hare was smooth, a testament to Captain Rostover's skill even under extreme stress. But instead of taxiing toward the bustling terminals of United or American, the Ascend Airjet was directed by ground control to a remote hardstand, a lonely stretch of concrete far from the public eye, often used for de-icing maintenance, or in this case, quarantine. As the plane came to a stop and the engine spooled down into an eerie silence, the passengers looked out the windows. There was no jet bridge. Instead, two black sedans with government plates and a van bearing the Ascend Air corporate logo were waiting on the tarmac, their presence ominous and official. Several figures in dark suits stood near the vehicles. Their arms crossed their faces, impassive. "Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft door is opened and we receive further instructions." Captain Rostover's voice announced the strain now audible. In the cabin, the tension was thick enough to taste. Heather and Brenda stood near the galley, avoiding eye contact with each other, and the passengers, their faces pale masks of dread. They knew this was not a standard medical debarkation. Paramedics didn't arrive in black sedans. The forward cabin door was opened not by a gate agent, but by a uniformed ground operations supervisor who immediately stepped aside. The first person to board the aircraft was a tall, severe-looking man in a sharply tailored suit. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet cabin. "I'm Captain Rostova," she replied, emerging from the cockpit. "I'm Miles Peterson, FAA." He said, not offering a handshake. The name hung in the air. Even the passengers who didn't know who he was could sense the immense authority in his title. "My team will take it from here. We need to deplane one passenger and her husband for medical attention, and then we need to speak with your entire cabin crew." He turned and his eyes scanned the first few rows of economy. He immediately found Annalise. He had only met her in person a few times at conferences, but he recognized her instantly. His expression softened with professional concern. "Dr. Dubois, Miles Peterson. I believe we're here for you." Slowly, painfully, Annalise stood up. David was right beside her, his arm protectively around her. The sight of this dignified woman, clearly in pain, being met by a high-ranking federal official, silenced any remaining doubt among the passengers about what had transpired. "Thank you for your prompt response, Miles," Annalise said, her voice quiet but firm. "It was the least we could do," he replied grimly. He gestured to one of his aides. "Please escort Dr. Dubois and her husband to the car. We have medical staff on standby." As Annalise and David walked toward the front of the plane, a strange thing happened. A passenger in an aisle seat started to clap slowly and deliberately. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire front half of the cabin was applauding, not for the drama, but in a quiet, powerful show of support for Annalise, and a stunning rebuke of the crew. It was a sound that Heather and Brenda would hear in their nightmares for years to come. Annalise paused, turned, and gave a small, grateful nod to the cabin before she disappeared through the doorway. Once she was off the plane, the atmosphere shifted back to cold, hard procedure. Peterson turned his attention to the crew. Purser Brenda Miller and flight attendant Heather Thompson, he said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "You are to surrender your crew IDs and passports to my colleague here. You are hereby grounded, pending a full FAA and internal airline investigation. You will be escorted off the aircraft separately. You are not to speak to each other. You will be taken to a secure room inside the terminal, where you will give your official statements." Heather began to sob, her composure completely disintegrating. "I was just following the rules," she whimpered, a pathetic reflexive defense. Peterson looked at her with utter contempt. "The rules you are following don't exist. The rules you broke, however, are very real and carry severe consequences." Frank O'Connell, the Ascend Air VP of Operations, who had been on the phone with Peterson earlier, had boarded the plane behind the FAA team. His face was a thundercloud of corporate fury. He looked at Brenda and Heather, not as employees, but as liabilities that were going to cost his company millions of dollars in fines, lawsuits, and reputational damage. "Get them off this plane," he snarled to his own security detail. Brenda was escorted off first, her head down, refusing to look at anyone. Heather followed, stumbling, her quiet sobs the only sound she made. The remaining two flight attendants looked on in shock and fear, realizing they were now witnesses in a major federal investigation. Peterson then addressed the rest of the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the FAA, I apologize for this significant disruption. This aircraft will now be taken to a gate where you will deplane. Ascend Air will handle all of your rebooking to New York, along with compensation for the delay. We appreciate your patience. The incident on the hard stand was a swift, brutal, and efficient operation. For Annalise, it was the beginning of a resolution. For Heather and Brenda, it was the beginning of the end. Their careers in aviation had ended on this lonely strip of concrete at O'Hare. They had been judged and found wanting, not in a distant corporate office, but right there on the aircraft in front of the very people they had mistreated, as the black sedan sped Annalise and David toward a private lounge where a doctor was waiting. David shook his head in amazement. "I've seen courtroom takedowns, but I've never seen anything like that." Annalise leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, the worst of the pain finally beginning to subside, with the knowledge that she could soon use a restroom. "It wasn't a takedown, David," she said quietly. "It was a system correcting itself. Sometimes it just needs the right person to point out the error." The ground operation was just the first step. The real consequences, the hard karma, was yet to come. The weeks following the incident on Flight 815 were a slow, methodical dissection of 2 careers and 1 airline's corporate culture. The story, initially suppressed by Ascend Air's frantic PR team, inevitably leaked. The man who had started the applause in the cabin, a software salesman named Gregory Finch, had written a detailed post on his LinkedIn page praising Dr. Dubois' unbelievable grace under pressure and condemning the disgusting abuse of power by the flight attendants. He didn't know Annalise's full story, but his post went viral in business and travel circles. The narrative was set: Ascend Air had a major problem. For Heather Thompson and Brenda Miller, life became a series of sterile interrogation rooms. They were questioned repeatedly by FAA investigators and Ascend Air's internal affairs team. Their stories, initially aligned, began to crumble under scrutiny. The FAA pulled the flight data recorder. It confirmed that at the time of the incident, the aircraft was at a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, 94 minutes from its scheduled landing time. There were no commands from the cockpit to prepare the cabin for descent. The first lie was officially exposed. Investigators then interviewed the other 2 cabin crew members. Both confirmed reluctantly that there was no operational reason to deny Annalise the use of the lavatory. One of them admitted she had overheard Brenda telling Heather to be firm with that type of passenger who always tries to bend the rules. The coded racial language was not lost on the investigators. The most damning evidence, however, came from Ascend Air's own internal records. The investigation into Heather and Brenda triggered a review of their past performance files. What they found was a pattern. Over the past 3 years, Heather Thompson had been named in 6 informal passenger complaints, 4 of which were from people of color, all alleging rude and dismissive behavior. Brenda Miller, as her supervisor, had personally cleared Heather in every single case, usually with a note that read, "FA was following procedure. Passenger was non-compliant." The picture became painfully clear. This wasn't a one-off event. It was a habit. Brenda had been grooming Heather, rewarding her prejudice with praise, and protecting her from consequences, creating a toxic microculture of discrimination within her team. Heather's motivation was not just a single power trip. It was a learned behavior reinforced by a mentor who encouraged her worst impulses. She had been trying to impress Brenda to secure a promotion to purser, and the way to do that, she believed, was to be tough in the way Brenda modeled. Faced with this mountain of evidence, their alliance shattered. Brenda, in a desperate attempt to save her 25-year career and pension, threw Heather under the bus. In her final interview, she claimed Heather had acted alone and had misrepresented the situation to her. She painted herself as a manager who had been misled by a rogue employee. Heather, in turn, felt the sting of betrayal. She produced text messages between her and Brenda from weeks before the flight, where they had complained about entitled passengers, and Brenda had praised Heather for not taking any nonsense. It was a pathetic attempt to spread the blame, but it only succeeded in cementing the fact that their actions were premeditated and rooted in bias. The consequences were swift and brutal. Ascend Air facing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from Annalise and David, which they had already filed, and the threat of massive FAA fines fired both women for gross misconduct and violations of federal regulations. But the karma didn't stop at termination. Ascend Air's legal department, in a move to demonstrate their seriousness to the FAA, provided the full investigation results to Annalise's legal team. This included the pattern of prior complaints. Annalise and David amended their lawsuit from a personal injury and discrimination claim into a much larger class action suit, inviting the other passengers who had filed complaints against Heather and Brenda over the years to join. The case was no longer just about them. It was about systemic failure. For Brenda Miller, the loss of her job was devastating. Her pension was gone. Her reputation in the tight-knit airline community was destroyed. At 52, she was unemployable in the only industry she had ever known. Her husband, shocked by the revelation, separated from her. She was forced to sell her suburban home and move into a small rented apartment, her life of comfortable authority reduced to ruin. For Heather Thompson, the fallout was even more public and humiliating. The LinkedIn post by Gregory Finch had led reporters to her social media profiles. They unearthed old posts containing racially insensitive jokes and politically charged rants. She became the face of the scandal, the flight attendant from hell. She was doxed, harassed, and became a pariah. Unable to find any work even in retail, she had to move back in with her parents in a small town in Ohio. The dream of a glamorous life flying the skies was replaced by the shame-filled reality of stocking shelves in her father's hardware store, where former high school classmates would whisper and point when she walked by. The hard karma wasn't just losing a job. It was the complete unraveling of their lives, brought about not by a single mistake, but by a long-standing attitude of prejudice and cruelty. They had chosen to target a quiet, unassuming black woman, believing her to be powerless. They couldn't have known she was the one person with the unique position and knowledge to pull the lever that would bring their entire world crashing down. They hadn't just misjudged a passenger, they had misjudged the fundamental laws of cause and effect. The legal battle concluded not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, but with a quiet, overwhelming surrender. Faced with the class action lawsuit, the mountain of internal evidence, and the continued scrutiny of the FAA, Ascend Air, settled. The financial terms were staggering. A significant 8-figure sum was placed into a fund to compensate not only Annalise and David, but also the dozen other victims who had joined the class action, finally receiving validation for the mistreatment they had endured years prior. Annalise and David, however, took none of the money for themselves. Their portion, the largest of the settlement, was donated in its entirety to establish the Dubois Aviation Justice Project, a non-profit foundation affiliated with the NHACCP Legal Defense Fund, dedicated to providing legal aid to individuals fighting discrimination in the travel industry. But for Annalise, the true victory wasn't financial. It was structural. As part of the settlement, Ascend Air was forced to enter into a consent decree with the FAA, a legally binding agreement that mandated a top-to-bottom overhaul of its policies. The most significant clause of this decree was the creation of a new mandatory training program for all 15,000 of its employees, from pilots to gate agents to flight attendants. The program would focus on implicit bias de-escalation, passenger rights, and the proper handling of in-flight medical needs. In a move of poetic justice, the FAA, at the recommendation of Miles Peterson, stipulated that the curriculum for this new program had to be developed and approved by an independent expert. And they had one specific expert in mind. 3 months after the incident, Anneliese found herself not in a courtroom, but in a boardroom at Ascend Air's corporate headquarters, sitting across the table from the same terrified VP, Frank O'Connell. She had not come as a victim or a litigant. She had come at their expense as the lead consultant hired to design the very training program that would prevent what happened to her from ever happening again. She was no longer Dr. Anneliese Dubois, the passenger in 22B. She was Dr. Anneliese Dubois, the architect of their redemption. For the next year, she worked with a team to build a powerful interactive program that used the real-life case of Flight 815, anonymized but unmistakable, as its central case study. She designed modules that forced employees to confront their own biases and to understand that the person in the passenger seat could be anyone, and that dignity was not contingent on one's perceived station in life. The Ascend Higher initiative, as the airline branded it, became the new gold standard in the industry. Other airlines spooked by the public relations disaster, and the massive settlement proactively licensed the training program for their own staff. The ripple effect of what happened on that single flight began to change the culture of an entire industry. Anneliese never saw Heather Thompson or Brenda Miller again. Their names became cautionary tales whispered in crew lounges, symbols of careers ended by arrogance and prejudice. Their hard karma was to be erased from the world they loved, while the woman they had wronged became one of its most influential reformers. Sometimes, when flying to a conference, Anneliese would see a flight attendant handle a difficult situation with a newfound patience and empathy. She would see a passenger with an urgent need being quietly and quickly escorted to the nearest available lavatory, regardless of cabin class. In these small moments, she saw the fruits of her ordeal. She hadn't sought the confrontation. She had simply demanded her basic right to be treated with dignity. But in doing so, she had inadvertently become an agent of profound change. Her story, which began with a moment of humiliating denial at 37,000 feet, ended up creating a legacy of respect and safety that would touch millions of travelers for years to come. The karma that had struck Heather and Brenda wasn't just punitive. It was transformative, echoing far beyond their ruined lives and reshaping the very skies they once flew. So what's the real takeaway from the story of Dr. Anneliese Dubois? It's a stark reminder that the person you might underestimate could be the one person you can't afford to cross. It's about how a quiet demand for dignity can unleash a torrent of consequences. This wasn't just about a flight attendant having a bad day. It was about a systemic rot of prejudice being exposed by a single focused beam of light. The karma that hit Brenda Miller and Heather Thompson was so devastating because it was earned, built over years of small cruelties that finally culminated in one catastrophic mistake. This story is a testament to the power of knowing your rights, standing your ground, and understanding the systems you operate within. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the hidden power dynamics we all navigate every day, please give this video a like and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of justice and unbelievable real-life karma. Your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light. Thank you for listening.